Morning.
Sometimes when I close my eyes and tilt my head just right, I can still see it. I'm really young and I'm being carried into a room. And over there in front of me is a metal sink filled with water and cloth or rags or something inside. Next to it is a stove with two burners on. One of them has a pot of boiling rice and the other has an iron. And there I am in my grandfather's laundry. I've spoken here about my grandfather before, but it's been a long time. He was born in Guangdong, China in 1893. To the best of my recollection, this would have been somewhere about 1968. I was maybe 18 months old. And I remember going there into his laundry. The next year, he was hit by a truck. And he couldn't work anymore. So my father said to him, "Dad, you're going to come and move in with us in our house in LaSalle." And so I want to tell you what it's like growing up with my grandfather in your house. We lived in this triplex, and his rooms were downstairs in the basement towards the back. He had his own bedroom and bathroom down there. And we had this playroom that was out in front of there. With the playroom, that means that every time that we had friends over, he would hear us because we were down there in the playroom. And he'd come out and he'd be there with his cane and he'd go, "Oh, hello, hello, hello." And he'd look at the other kids and he'd say, "You, what you name?" And the kid would tell them his name and he would say, "Oh, hi, you call me Baba." We all called him Baba. I don't know why. The Cantonese term for grandfather is actually Yi, but for him, it was Baba. One of my earliest memories beyond the laundry with him, I was maybe 5 years old. And he would say to me one summer morning, "Oh, Loki," he called me Lucky. "Lucky, you come with me today. We walk up street to Miracle Mart. I buy you hot dog." And that's what we would do. He would get dressed up. He'd put on his suit because you're going out, you put on a suit. He'd put on a suit, he'd put on his hat, his cane in one hand, and me my hat behind in the other. And we'd walk very slowly up the street to the Place LaSalle Miracle Mart Mall. He'd have me climb up on top of the stool, climb up on the stool at the picnic restaurant, and he'd say to the lady behind the counter, "Oh, you lady, you give him hot dog." And he'd get me a hot dog, and we'd walk through the mall, and I'd spend that time with my Baba. Saturday mornings were really special, because again, his room is in the basement in the back, and we got the playroom in the front. And you know what's in the playroom? The TV. And we're talking about Saturday mornings in the 1970s. This was the time for Saturday morning cartoons. My brother, sister, and I would all be down there. We'd be watching Scooby-Doo and the Jetsons and all these great shows. And eventually, my grandfather would come out, and we'd all look at him, and we'd go, "Nehoma, Baba, Nehoma." And he'd look at us, "Ho, ho, ho. Oh, you want a breakfast?" And he would have in his hands 3 bowls of egg fried rice with Chinese sausage. It is the best breakfast you could ever have. Fantastic. To this day, one of my favorite meals. And Sundays is when the magic really came to life. Every Sunday, my father would drive Baba into Chinatown. Living in LaSalle, there were no other Chinese people around, and he barely spoke English. But he would take him into Chinatown, and my grandfather could spend the day walking the streets, visiting with friends, going into shops, and really just getting a chance to experience his normal life. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, we would go to Chinatown and we would find him in the back of this one shop. The shop is still there to this day. He'd be sitting in this hard-chaired back with a cane in front of him, usually sleeping. And we would say to him, "Hola, Papa, we're here." And he would say, "Oh." He'd reach down, he'd pick up the bag, the plastic bag that I had next to him, and we would all walk off to a restaurant. Now, this was exceptionally special because in those days, we didn't have much. If we were going to a restaurant, it was only because Bubba was taking us. He'd walk in, he'd take the bag, he'd say something to the waiter. That bag would disappear and come back served on plates in front of us. He'd actually bring his own food. He would then order off the Chinese menu, because everything that they say about Chinese menus in Chinatown, they're two different prices, entirely true, especially back in the 1970s. And we would have this feast with Bubba. He lived with us until 1983, when at 90 years old, he fell and he couldn't get up. So my parents and he agreed that it was time to move into the geriatric center at the Montreal Chinese Hospital. We kept up with the Sunday visits. He eventually met all of our partners, all of our spouses, and one of his great-grandchildren. And he finally passed away in April of 1991, just shy of his 98th birthday. A few years ago, my parents called me up and they said that they had something for me. When my grandfather had his laundry, he had this stamp that they would use to stamp the shirt tails and the pockets to say that this was the person who did their laundry, and they would bring the clothes back to him. This hand-carved stamp, that is his name mirrored, is 100 years old, and it's probably my most prized possession. And they gave it to me. I guess I'm lucky.